All right, let me turn over to my laptop so you all can kind of see what's going on here. Okay, all right, so let's get started. Welcome to Lecture 3 in Engineering Co-op Prep. Let me go through a couple of quick announcements. So on Blackboard, the attendance grades from the last 2 lectures should be up to date. You all just scanned the QR code just a little bit ago to do the attendance for this lecture. So we'll have that posted sometime either today or maybe tomorrow or whatnot. But we usually try and keep the attendance grades pretty up to date since, for this class, attendance is worth quite a bit. So right now, and I haven't been here for the last couple of lectures, so correct me, if I'm mistaken. I don't think I am. That the resume, the first draft of the resume was due now on Handshake. What we have typically done in the past is you all submitted your first draft of the resume on Handshake. We used job tracks in the past, now we're using Handshake. But long story short of it is, so if your resume needs complete and total overhaul, they'll let you know through Handshake and you'll submit a final draft, okay? But if your resume is good, or if there are any hyper minor, adjustments that need to be made, then they might do them themselves and then just say they're good, okay? Now I want to be clear, the syllabus says that there are 2 resume submissions, the draft and the final. But if you hear back from Career Services that your draft is good, then you're good. You don't need to submit again, okay? The idea is that if you need to revise your resume quite a bit, then you have that other submission date. So does that make sense? Yes, sir.
So just to make sure, they won't email us directly. They'll go through Handshake to get.
As I understand the answer to that, yes. If I find out differently, I will let you know. What is supposed to happen is we're going to get a list from them of everybody who's on Handshake. So as soon as we get that, if there's anybody missing or whatnot, we'll let everybody know. There is a column now on Blackboard for the resume submission, and I put a little handout that just said like the due dates and whatnot. There's really nothing you need to do, but on that column, once we get your basically once we get the green check mark, if you will, from Career Education, we will then go through and apply those grades. So you won't need to do anything for this homework assignment through Blackboard. There are going to be some homework assignments in the future where you'll need to upload a document to Blackboard. We have some papers that we're going to do in here. There's going to be an ethics assignment, an assignment on continuing education requirements for PE licensure, and some other things that you're going to do through Blackboard. But for this one, it's just straight through Handshake. Any questions? Okay, so today you were going to have a lecture about the co-op application process, but Tanner's not here. So what we did is we switched Lecture 4 and Lecture 3. So we're going to talk about professional concepts today. Either one doesn't really have a doesn't really hold us back or anything in terms of progress and whatnot throughout the course. So it just seemed to make sense, especially since Tanner's our co-op coordinator, that he should be the one that talks about the co-op application process. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some professional concepts. So this is really sort of a really laid-back lecture. There's not going to be some in-depth homework assignment, as a result of this. So I don't want anybody to get all freaked out that they need to take every note and everything, because that's not really what this lecture is about. What I want to talk about today is I want to be a little relaxed with you, and I want to talk about requirements and behaviors that you should exhibit in the workplace. One of the things that was on the announcement slide, I just realized I kind of glossed over. So if you've ever had me for class before, I think some of you have. I have a tendency to record my lectures and post them to YouTube. I'm recording this lecture now. I created a YouTube playlist for the class, and so at least the lectures that I give, I'll record them and post them to the YouTube playlist for posterity. The link for the YouTube playlist is on Blackboard, so you don't need to go find it and whatnot. If you've had me for class before, it's set up the same way as I've done other courses and whatnot. So, sound good? All right. So today I want to talk about concepts and strategies that I think will help you succeed in the workplace. See, one of the things that I think you should keep in mind is that if you have summer internship or a co-op or any employment experience while you're in college, especially an employment experience that is in our sector, in the engineering sector. I'm not talking about a job at McDonald's or mowing lawns or anything like that. I'm talking about working for a DOT or an Army Corps of Engineers, or working for Toyota or West Virginia Steel, or working for an engineering firm, construction company, et cetera. If you're working in that sector, what you need to realize is that either directly or indirectly, that experience is one log job interview. That's just the truth, because what they are assessing with you is whether or not they want to bring you on full time. And here's the other thing. Let's say that's not even in the cards. Let's say that you are working part-time for West Virginia Steel because your plan is, whenever you graduate, to go work on a hydroelectric dam in Idaho. Okay, you know. Even if you don't plan to work at that particular location full-time, what you are cultivating are references, your character in the workplace. And that is going to travel with you, I'm telling you, okay? And it's starting now. It's starting probably a lot sooner than you think. And so I want to give you some advice and introduce you to some concepts that I think would give you a little bit of an edge. I'm going to start with just some stuff I think you need to keep in mind when you're in the workplace. A lot of this is common sense, but I think will give you an edge, and so there's some do's and don'ts, if you will. And then I want to talk about some other things about engineering operations that I think will illuminate how things work, like some financial operations, how timesheets work. We'll talk about how projects get funded and that process, especially if you're working in the private sector. I think some of that knowledge will help you out a little bit. And this is sort of part of a two-part lecture, because later on we're going to have maybe sort of a professional concepts part 2, and we're going to talk about some more specific things related to communication. One of the things that you all are going to be doing when you get out of here is sending emails, attending business meetings, preparing meeting minutes, and things like that. That's going to happen in any field you go into. And there's some protocols. There's some do's and don'ts. And I want to arm you with that information so that when you get out of here that you're competitive. So let's start off with Dr. Mike's tips for your professional success. And I guess I should give you the disclaimer that these are my tips. I'm sure somebody could tweak these or add to these, or they might even disagree with them. And that's okay. But these are rules that I've lived by, and I think that they've served me well, and I think that they'll serve you well also. So first off, I would argue that the number one requirement for success is dependability, okay? Right off the bat. Be the person that doesn't miss a deadline, be available. I think that right off the bat is probably the one characteristic. I think it will get you promoted faster. Responsibility tends to self-propagate in the workplace. You know, if you demonstrate that you can handle responsibility, you tend to get more of it, okay? And that tends to mean promotions. Promotions tend to mean more money. There's a pretty linear curve, or linear trend between the amount of responsibility that you have and the salary that you get. The more money you get, the more you're responsible for. And maybe I should take a step back and go, there are maybe sort of two tracks that you can take in your careers, and some of you might want to be aggressive in your careers and take on as much responsibility and get promoted and be that project manager at 35, 40 years old that's making six figures, which is very possible in the engineering disciplines. But that's also a stressful job, The more money you make, the more responsibility you have, the more stress that you have. And some folks, that's not what they're after. They're after the 9 to 5, salaried, comfortable position, maybe in a government agency or a small engineering firm. Maybe that works for you too. So, but regardless, I think that there are some things that you need to demonstrate that will make you competitive. The facts are, when jobs come out, you're not the only one applying for them. There's going to be people at other institutions, people at this institution applying. So how do you set yourself apart? Okay. So I think dependability is probably one of the biggest traits that will give you an edge. The other trait is to do your job and do it well. I was always taught that a job well done is done in such a fashion that the next person down the line doesn't have to pick up your slack. And I think that you should exhibit that in your careers. Your management's going to notice. Like, even if they give you something simple, make the copies, sweep the floor. If you can't sweep the floor, how are they going to trust you to do something more important? Okay? So if you're not exhibiting those traits, I see your forecasts for your promotion, for your potential employment are not going to go well. And so again, this is me telling you what I think you need to know in order to succeed. Communication, communication, communication. In our disciplines, we rarely work in silos, okay? There's an old joke about engineers that an introverted engineer stares at their shoes when they talk to somebody, and an extroverted engineer stares at the other person's shoes. That's a joke. But there's the point behind that is that a lot of times, you might think, well, I'm going to get out of here, and let's say I'm an electrical engineer, and I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to do programming for a control system for a power plant. And so I'm just going to get stuck in a cubicle by myself. And to be clear, there's a lot of people that might enjoy that. Like, just leave me alone, let me do my programming, and I'll be a happy camper. But it doesn't really work that way. The facts are, you're going to be working on projects, coordinating with other departments at your company or your organization. You're going to be coordinating with other companies. So, for example, I'm a bridge engineer, okay? That's what I do. I design bridges. So I could talk about bridge design all day long. But whether or not I work for a public or a government organization like a state DOT or a federal agency, or I work in the private sector, I'm going to have to coordinate with various departments at the state DOT. If there's a design firm that we've contracted out a given job to, let's say I work at the state DOT or state road. So we might put a project out for bid, HNTB bids on it, right? So they're going to be producing the designs, right? So we got to coordinate with them to ensure that the designs are meeting our standards. Now we've got the designs, now it's got to get built. So now we're going to do another bidding. Slope construction wins the bid, right? So now there's inspections, there's quality control, there's project management, et cetera. There's going to be a lot of components that go into that. Communicating what's going on and what you're doing is very critical in our field, okay? It is okay to ask questions, okay? It's okay to ask questions. At some point, you need to demonstrate competency and the ability to handle things on your own, but I would much prefer that if you're unsure about something, ask. Just going off and doing your own thing, that is a recipe for stymieing progress. That is a recipe for holding the project back, okay? So the folks that just sort of do stuff on their own, like it's the Wild West, they tend to not do very well, okay? So that's just the truth. I think if you demonstrate that, and it's hard to define tangibly, but that quality of going above and beyond the call of duty, not just doing a job and doing it well, but seeking out what needs to be done to improve things, those are the types of things that will get you the position that you're after, sort of doing the job before you get the position. Now, here's some things that you might experience when you get out of here. So you get out of here, and when I say get out of here, I mean get out of here like this semester. Let's say this summer you go to work for, John Hancock Engineering Incorporated, right? And so you're an office intern. And so you're the one who's making copies and maybe getting a 30-minute lunch break and so on and so forth. And then you get there and your supervisors are going out and they're, they've got the company cars and they're going out for an hour lunch or something like that. And you're sitting there going, wait a minute, how come I only get the half-hour lunch and all these other people here are getting all these perks and whatnot? Well, some of that you get with seniority. Some of that is related to securing clients for additional projects. So just be aware that, that happens. It's the truth. Everyone has to serve their time in the trenches. One of the other things that I think is important for you now is to, and I want to be clear in what I'm saying here. If you are right now applying for an internship and somebody offers you the job, but it's a summer internship, but it's not quite what you want to do, you're saying, I don't really want to do that. No, accept it. I think that if you've got the opportunity to accrue experience in the engineering sector, do it. Even if it's outside your area. As I said, I'm a structural engineer, right? I design bridges. My work experience when I was in undergrad was largely in water, in H&H. I worked for a small engineering firm back home, and we did a lot of surveying, a lot of mapping, but a lot of the design stuff I did was like site planning. It was erosion and sediment control. It was not bridges. It certainly wasn't. But that's not what really mattered at that point in my life. What mattered was accruing the experience, understanding how billable hours worked, understanding what it meant to produce on a deadline. Those skills, you don't really get that in engineering 216, in mechanics of deformable bodies, or thermo, or dynamics, or whatever. That's something you really only get in the field. And so if you've got some position, but it doesn't seem like the sexiest thing that you can be doing, but it's a position that you can put on your resume that you've accrued experience, do it. This is the time to build your resume to show that you're willing to take that extra work. One of the positions that I had when I was in undergrad was at a company called Fugro Chance. It's a company that was in Houston. So they flew me down to Houston. I spent a summer in Houston, and I did GPS positioning in the Gulf of Mexico. So I spent about 2 months on oil rigs and boats and whatnot. And I got to say, it was an adventure. I mean, there were times I literally felt like I was on pirate ships and whatnot in the Gulf. It was a lot of fun. I didn't even mind the food. The people were amazing to work with. I ended up not taking that position at the end because I actually just didn't like the job. The job wasn't for me, but the experience was invaluable. It helped form me into the person that I am today. So don't, be very cautious in turning stuff down. I don't want you to turn positions down, and that's like the last position you're ever offered. It honestly doesn't demonstrate a good quality. The good problem to have is like when it's your last semester and you've got 2 different job offers and you don't know which job offer to take. That's a great problem to have. I have had students in that scenario, and it's stressful. It really is, because you've got to make a decision that might craft the rest of your life. But that's a good problem to have, and you're not going to have that problem if you're turning down positions. Does that make sense? Again, this is my experience. If you have any questions throughout all of this, or if there's anything that you can offer as an observation, or if there's anything, don't hesitate. I'm an easy guy to get along with. At least ask my 216 students or my 414 students. It's not Alejandro, right? It's an inside joke. Okay. Here's some advice for your experience in the workplace. I do think that whenever you get to a given company, if you're at an engineering firm, a public agency, a Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, I think it's a good idea to learn the management structure of the company. Like, you're going to know who your boss is, but it's kind of good to see, what you can learn about the company as a whole. Again, part of this process is for you to accrue that experience, and so some of that involves understanding the organization that you work for. Like I kind of think a good rule of thumb is that, if you're doing a job well, that you're keeping your supervisor happy and maybe even their supervisor happy. But one thing I do want to give you a word of warning against is to make sure that you're respecting the chain of command. And what I mean by that is, you're going to get a job at some firm or some organization or what have you, and you're going to have a boss, okay? You report to that boss. I have seen it more often than not when people go over their boss's head, go to their boss or their boss's boss, and That's not good, especially when you're working on a project and there's a process in place to ensure that the designs are done appropriately and the work's getting done appropriately, and everything's getting billed appropriately. And if you're going over your boss's head, it can clearly convey to your supervisor that you don't respect them, that you don't respect the process and the procedure, and so don't do that. I've seen that happen a lot, and it never really tends to end well. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, like if you have a question that your boss can't answer and you need to go to the next level up, I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying I think everybody knows what I mean when I say going over your boss's head, and I'm saying don't do that, okay? I don't think that goes well. One of the things that you are going to have when you get out of here are meetings and conference calls. I say meetings and conference calls. I also mean Zoom or Teams or whatever. I can tell you right now, if the pandemic were to just vanish like Thanos snapping his fingers, Teams and Zoom and all that stuff is not going anywhere, okay? It is just too profitable, if I'm being honest, for some engineering firms and some engineering organizations. One of the things that the pandemic did is it, you know, let me just sort of be real with you a little bit. I became a professor in 2014. If you asked me in 2014 or 2015, could we honestly deliver engineering education, quality engineering education online? I said, no. I was biased that way. I just didn't think we could do it. Now, look what's happened. You know, we had a whole year of online education. Now, we could have a healthy and honest debate about whether or not that virtual year was good or not. You know, I'm sure we had our positive and negative experiences as students and faculty, right? But let me tell you the truth about what that meant in the private sector. Right? I can't tell you how many times that you're working on a project and stuff happens. You know, you have setbacks, you have holdups, you need clarifications on given items, and so let's have a meeting, right? And before, you get in your car, you drive to where you need to go. Maybe it's a flight, maybe you need to stay overnight. Now, turn on your webcam, hit on Teams, and there's everybody right there all in one room. The amount of productivity increases that you see in the private sector, even in the public sector, as a result of the integration of Zoom and Teams and so on and so forth, it's not going anywhere. I just don't think it is. And so that I want to prepare you for, but I also want you to make sure that those meetings go well. I can't tell you how many meetings that I've been in where the agenda goes out the window. You start talking about something, and then it just goes on the rails, and you never actually get anything done. Okay, so if you're ever having meetings in the future, and to be clear, even as interns, you might even be organizing some of this stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've seen students at places like Marathon or some engineering firms that they're asked to do little projects, and so they got to organize stuff. If you're ever in charge of setting up calls or meetings, develop an agenda. Send that agenda to people in advance so that they know what they're talking to. I can't tell you how many times I've had to attend a meeting and I get the agenda as soon as I show up, or I don't even know what I'm supposed to talk about. It's incredibly infuriating because if I needed to prepare something in advance, I'd like to know so that the meeting is productive. So make sure that you're not that person. Set a time limit for each agenda item if you need to, and try to stick to it. Now, there's a healthy balance there because you don't, like if there's an organic discussion that's actually going to increase productivity, you don't want to stymie that, but you were there to get certain action items done, so make sure you're trying to stick to it. Now, let's talk about notes and correspondence. One of the things that you have to get used to in engineering practice is that incredibly rarely are you going to be working on one project at a time. That almost never happens. More often than not, what's going to happen is the day you get a job as a staff engineer at an engineering firm, you're going to get 6 projects. Some of them are going to be brand new. Some of them are going to be finishing up. Some of them you might be right in the middle of them. And take that day and then fast forward a year. You are not going to remember why you selected 8 bolts for that truss connection, or why you selected that size power line for that transmission tower. You're not going to remember, okay? So as much as you think you will remember, you won't, okay? So document everything that you're doing. You know, if you're making design decisions, document your assumptions. It is very possible that as you move through a given project, you might be rotated off and put on another assignment. That happens all the time. So making a clear documented choices of what you're doing and why you're doing it, all that's going to do is help your coworkers down the line. Whenever you have a meeting, it is very, very common to send an email to all parties involved to state, okay, we had this meeting, this is what everybody said they were going to do. You're going to do these tasks. You're going to do these. You're going to do these. We're going to have them done by these dates. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks, see where everybody's at, and so on and so forth. So I think that's those are incredibly valuable traits that will keep you moving forward. All right, I'm just curious, does anybody have any questions about what I've talked about so far? Is there anything you thought that I missed? Anything you think that should be added? Because this is good stuff. All this is going to do is benefit you in your careers. I want everybody in here to get a job and make a lot of money and buy their pickup trucks and, you know, video games and whatever they think they need to buy with all their money. So, yes, sir.
So I know that there are summer co-ops.
Yes.
I was wondering for people that may have like stuff to do in the later half of the summer, are there any like co-ops that are like specifically for like the earlier part of the summer?
That's a good question. So the best way of answering that would, I think it would depend on your specific circumstance and one, what you wanted to do, where you're going to be. I'm saying that because I'm seeing a San Antonio on your shirt, and I don't know if you actually are still going to be in the area or you're going to be like out in Texas or something. I don't know. But the best, honestly, the best person I talk to is Tanner, because there might be some experiences that end a little sooner. For example, and I'm telling you so that you're aware, the experience that I had at the company in Texas, the one where I was on the oil rigs and whatnot. So the way my experience worked was they flew me down there. I spent about 2 weeks doing all of the required training. They had to train me on the software. I had to do safety training. They literally put me in a helicopter-sized simulator. They took that simulator, they lifted it on a crane, they threw it in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and I had to escape the helicopter as it was sinking in the water. That's a story. But I'll tell that story near the end. But long story short is, so once we did the training, we would get these assignments, and it might be 3 weeks on the Chickasaw, or 4 weeks on the Ocean Intervention 3, or a week and a half on this oil platform. And so near the end of the summer, I got to a point where like school was getting ready to start up in about 3 weeks, and so it was like, do I go on another boat or do I just go home? And I ended up going home because it didn't make sense with when the semester was going to start. So there might be a prospect where there's a job and it's actually going to end in June or July or wherever, and I don't know. It's going to be a function of, you know, where you go. Yes?
A lot of places like that will actually kind of take that into consideration, like when you go back to school and stuff, because like I'm an RA, so I had to go back. I had to come back here like the 2nd of August for training.
Yeah.
So my internship ended at the very end of July. Like, and they told me I could wait until like the end of August is usually when it goes till.
Yeah.
But like a lot of places are pretty flexible.
The other thing to keep in mind is what I said at the beginning, is that a lot of times these co-ops and internships, don't get me wrong, they need the help. They wouldn't be putting, you know, cash money on the table if they didn't need you to produce for the company. But they are also interested in potentially making an investment in you in the long term. So if it's, we need to end the internship like a couple weeks early, they're thinking, like, I want to hire you for the next 5 years. Who cares if I got to end the internship a couple weeks early if you're worth it? You see what I mean? So that's usually not the biggest deal, you know. This is good stuff, though. I really like this. Any other questions? Now, I'm curious about something. Has anybody here, you probably lifted your hand a little bit, but has anybody here already had an experience either in the engineering private sector, worked for a firm, construction company, DOH, Toyota, anything like that? Anybody had one of those experiences? Okay, this is good stuff.
I had a, let's see, intern at the DOH back at 16 and 18.
Okay. All right. So your experience and anybody else's experience who worked in the public sector might be like this. It might not. If you worked in the private sector, you probably definitely had the experience of completing a timesheet with different jobs. Anybody know what I'm talking about there? So if not, I want to talk a little bit about the financial operations, because in the end, when you're working at an engineering firm, the engineering firm is in it to make money. And to be clear, the experience of working at a government sector or agency and the environment is beyond different than what you get in the private sector. If you're in the private sector, you are trying to win jobs and win contracts to keep yourself afloat and make money. And you submit a bid, you don't get that job, the office might shut down. I mean, there's no guarantee that a given engineering firm or a given construction company stays open. It's not like the West Virginia DOH. I mean, they'll always be there. You know what I mean? I mean, there might be fluctuations in the economy, but we're pretty much always going to have a state road, whereas we might not always have an ABC Engineering Incorporated. And so the environment is different, okay? If you're working for the private sector, one of the things that I think you ought to be aware of is some of the financial operations and how these places work. And I'd argue the most important place to start is the timesheet, okay? Now, I have a scanned sort of pencil and paper example of a timesheet. Doesn't matter. They're probably nowadays they're more computer-based than they are paper-based. But a couple things about timesheets. Number one, these are legal documents because timesheets will delineate who gets billed what. And so you claiming you worked so many hours on a given job, that's how it gets billed. Nobody should be submitting a timesheet for anybody else. Your timesheet, you're the one who should be responsible for that. No one should be submitting your timesheet. No one should be modifying your timesheet after it's submitted. Timesheets, submit them when they're due. Don't be late on that stuff. That causes accounting problems. That causes payroll problems, etc. Don't be late. This is kind of an example of what a timesheet looks like. The firm that I worked at, they were very similar to this. So the way that it would work is, so you would have tasks over here on the left. And so at the firm that I worked at, you would have a task, but then you would also list the project number, right? Every time that the firm got a client or got a new job, there would be a project number. So it is the year 2022. So the project numbers might be like 22-001, 22-002, every time we got a new job that year. And so let's say that our job, let's keep it simple. Let's say that somebody was buying a house and they needed a boundary survey for the lot, right? So what that means is that you have to go in and locate the property corners and do a detailed, accurate map of the plot. And so that might be necessary if you're taking a loan out to purchase the property or doing improvements, putting a fence in, all sorts of things. So the task might be, okay, this is job 22-001, and I spent an hour at the courthouse doing deed research because I need the deeds for this property and for adjacent properties to find the property corners. I spent 3 hours there at the site. I went out to the site, located the property corners, set any new corners that needed to be set, etc. Then I might have another task where I spent 2 hours drawing everything up in AutoCAD, etc., etc. So attaching tasks to the job numbers was critical because you needed to be able to bill that appropriately. Because there were different rates for whether or not we were doing engineering work or surveying work, etc. And so on Monday, I might have worked, 4.5 hours on this, 1.5 hours on that, 2 hours on this, etc. And so the idea is if I worked 8 hours on Monday, well then I'd have 8 hours down here, maybe 6 hours here, 8 hours here, 9 hours there, etc. And so the idea is that I would sum up all of my daily hours and I would sum up all my task totals and I would get the appropriate number of hours that I worked that given week. And so the idea of summing this way and summing this way is just sort of a numerical check that you've done everything correctly. Most software programs and whatnot will do this kind of stuff for you. But getting this stuff right is pretty important. Now, what you might do is if, let's say it's an engineering project and you're going out onto site with a crew, like it's not just you, there's a bunch of people. You might verify with people, okay, we left at 8, we got back at 11:30, so that's 3.5 hours. Like, you might verify with your crew to ensure that the hours are consistent, but you're not doing the timesheets for each other. So that's something you need to handle yourself. Also of importance to a company is its balance sheet. So there are two sort of financial statements for a given company that you might want to be aware of, and this is especially true if you work in the private sector. So there's the balance sheet and the P&L sheet. So the balance sheet is basically a snapshot of the company's health at a given time. What it does is it lists or it illustrates to anybody that wants to look at it what a company owns and what a company owes at any given time. Its assets and its liabilities, okay? So the difference between assets and liabilities, how many of you have heard that term, assets and liabilities? All right. So an asset is just that. It is a net positive for the company. So it might be inventory or money in the bank, et cetera. And then a liability is what you owe, like, rent, water bill, so on and so forth. Any difference between assets and liabilities is what's known as equity. So, for example, if you own a car that's 15 grand, that's an asset. But if you owe a $5,000 loan against that car, that's a liability. So that car represents $10,000 of equity, right? That's the net, the difference between the two, right? And so a statement for a company might look something like this. This is a balance sheet from Paul's Guitar Shop, right? So this will give you kind of an idea. So the assets might be, okay, what are the assets for Paul's Guitar Shop? Well, he's got about 33 grand in cash on hand. He's got $300 in accounts receivable, right? So that might be that he did some repairs on some guitars and he's got some money coming into him. He's got his about 40 grand in guitar inventory in the store. So his total current assets, with some added some prepaid rent on that, might be about 74 grand. And his long-term assets, well, he's got some improvements that he's done to the property. So that's some stuff that he doesn't have to worry about for later. And so just, combining all that, so his total long-term, or his total assets are about 172 grand. So then you compare that against the liabilities. Well, he's got accounts payable. He probably had to pay for some of that inventory in the store. He's got some miscellaneous accrued expenses, maybe, some of the equipment that he uses to repair guitars. Maybe that stuff needs to get fixed. Some unearned revenue, so maybe that was some work that he did that he didn't get paid for. It happens, and engineering sectors as well, and so on and so forth. And so the good news is that he's got more assets than he does liabilities. There's a little bit of equity left over at the end of the day. That's good. When it's the other way around, usually not so good. Unfortunately, though, the balance sheet gives you a snapshot only in one point in time. What tends to supplement that is a P&L statement or an income statement. A balance sheet will give you a snapshot at a specific point in time. The balance sheet the income statement will give you the performance over a period of time. So if we were looking at Paul's Guitar Shop, we might look at the income statement for a given year. So this is the year that ended on December 31st. So we might look at the total amount of revenue that the company experienced versus the expenses, and hopefully, the income or the revenue exceeded the expenses, so there actually is a net income at the end of the day. One of the things I'm curious about, how many of you have ever heard the term fiscal year? Does anybody know anybody have an idea of what that means? What is a fiscal year? So we obviously know what the calendar year is, right? The calendar year goes from January 1st to December 31st, right? And that defines how we define a year as. However, fiscal years are essentially the same thing, but they're an annual period defined for particular accounting structures. and they're usually different than the calendar year when it makes sense for that given organization. I'll give you a perfect example. The fiscal year at Marshall University goes from July 1st to June 30th, right? So from an accounting perspective, the year ends at the end of June. Now, why does that make sense? Well, this is a university, right? The fall semester, then the spring semester, and then we start it all over again, right? So it makes sense for our fiscal year to end in the middle of the summer, because that's kind of when nothing's happening. Does that make sense? You know, it doesn't really make sense for the fiscal year to end in December, because we still got a whole nother semester to get through. At the Army Corps of Engineers, the fiscal year ends on September 30th. So, and it starts back up on October 1st. That's just, again, how their business is structured. All right. Let's talk a little bit about insurance. How many of you have heard of liability insurance? So liability insurance is when a surgeon is performing an operation and they decide to leave a junior mint in the cavity before they sew it up, right? And whoops, that's a Seinfeld reference. Long, yeah. Engineers carry errors and omissions insurance as well. And that tends to be covered by your firm. If you ever wanted to go into private practice, it would be incredibly important for you to obtain insurance in order to practice. There is no way I'd be designing a bridge without the appropriate umbrella insurances and what have you. And so that's something you might want to pay attention to at your given firm, or if you're planning on being an entrepreneur and starting your own business, because understanding, you know, how much coverage you need from a general liability perspective or your professional liability perspective, whether that insurance is claims made or whatnot, how your automobile insurance is. I mean, there's plenty of company cars, but then taking that home and so on and so forth, that's kind of important. All right. Last thing, and I'll gloss through this kind of quickly because I kind of think it's important, just so that you understand the process. And this is the steps required to actually obtain work. And this is how it's going to work for most engineering disciplines. The idea is that you don't just show up and, oh, I have something to work on. There is a process by which you obtain that work. So for instance, Geico decides they want a new corporate headquarters, right? The Gecko needs more floor space for the office building, right? Well, that doesn't just happen, right? So in those instances, what happens is, you know, the Gecko will find, let's say, a land developer or a development firm and say, I need a new corporate headquarters. And so that development firm will start preparing concepts and what have you, but then they'll start seeking out contractors or subcontractors to start to develop that work. There might be an architecture firm that prepares the plans. And then now you've got the building. There's a structural engineer that ensures that the building is going to stand upright. It's not going to fall down and kill anybody. You might have a mechanical engineer that goes in and designs the HVAC system. You know, you go into contracting land. You've got construction companies that are building it, and so on and so forth. So how does that stuff usually start from a process perspective? So it usually starts with an EOI, which is called an expression of interest request. This is when Geico, or the development firm, if you will, is sending out a firm to see who is interested in potentially bidding on this project in the future. And so basically that's just sort of like, put me on your list, or nah, I'm not interested. Then they finally start actually asking for the proposal, the RFP, the request for proposal. This is when they're actually starting the process of developing bids for a given project. Oh, by the way, this presentation is on Blackboard, so in case you missed something. Have you ever heard the term shortlisted? Do you know what that means? So shortlisting is when, and the same thing happens in job interviews. You have a job interview, or you have a position that you want to hire for a staff engineer at an office. 50 people apply. You take that 50 people and you whittle it down to a prime list of about 5 or 10 really good candidates. That's shortlisting, right? That's putting you on the list. Okay, we're really going to pay attention to this. And so the same thing is true in project selection, right? Geico wants a new corporate headquarters, right? And so they put that out. We're requesting proposals. And so 10 or 12 engineering firms put out bids. The bid review committee will take a look at it and go, that bid is way off, throw it out. That bid's way too expensive, throw it out. And then they start whittling it down to a short list of potential candidates. They go through a formal interview process, usually, where the firm or the desired firm will make a presentation. This is the corporate headquarters we want to build for Geico Insurance. This is how much we think it's going to cost. This is how it's going to look. This is our schedule, so on and so forth. And so it's usually like a pretty formal presentation in front of a panel. That's how big projects work. Sometimes for smaller projects, it might just be a direct award. Client shows up, they award it, end of the day. Let's talk about deliverables. Engineers tend to produce specifications and drawings. That's what we're producing. More often than not, we're not actually producing the widget or the gizmo at the end of the day. We're actually just producing the means by which a contractor or construction company can build it themselves. One of the things that is pretty rare in engineering specifications are what are called means and methods. In other words, if I was designing this table, I would say, here's what the table needs to look like at the end of the day. You're the contractor, you figure out how to build it, okay? And that's very common because it allows contractors and fabricators and construction companies and what have you, it allows them the freedom, if you will, to spec out the project and to construct it and fabricate it in their own manner. The only times that means and methods or special items are dictated are if they're very, very important. You know, like you will use this particular material and here's why. But usually very rarely does that happen. For example, in, let's say, electrical engineering land, if you're designing a power transmission system, you're just going to size the lines and size the distribution, let somebody else figure out how to build it, because that's what they do. You're the person speccing out the system. They're the ones who are actually delivering it. Let's see, what time is it? We're starting to run a little bit out of time. Once the project gets awarded, you start working with the owner and the whatnot on getting the bid documents prepared. This is when the design starts going into the contracting aspect. So you're basically creating the bid request for actually constructing the gadget or the widget or the gizmo and what have you, and then ultimately awarding that to a contractor or fabricator to actually construct it. The one or the two things, I guess, that I want you to be aware of before we close the lecture is, as you're working on a project, the one thing that you might want to try and keep your ear out for is what's called a change order. Have anybody ever heard of a change order? So here's what a change order is. I'm, you know, the gecko, and I want a corporate headquarters, right? And so we go out, we get the designs, we do the bid, and this contractor says he can do it for $30 million. Okay, here's $30 million. Build me a corporate headquarters. And then 6 months later he goes, yeah, it's going to be $35 million. That's a change order. That's not a fun day. We tend to live in a very litigious society. Do you know what the word litigious means? That means things get litigated upon. That means we have lawyers involved and lawsuits and all sorts and so on and so forth. I gave you $30 million. Why are you asking me for 35, right? There better be a good reason, right? To be clear, stuff happens. You know, you do a bid for a new building, and then you start laying the foundation. You find that the soil properties are way different than you thought they were going to be, and you're going to need a beefier foundation. It happens, you know, but you want to try and avoid them. Change orders are something that needs to be handled very delicately. The client hates them for obvious reasons. That if you need to issue them, the best thing to do is be honest, do the work, or issue the change order or deal with that as quickly as possible to reduce conflict at the end of the project. Just keep your ear out for stuff like that, because if you start hearing those words, things might get a little tense. Value engineering is something that tends to be a lot more popular these days. That's what happens when an engineer produces a design and then it goes out to bid, and the contractor says, well, actually I could do it this way, and it saves you 10% of the price. I can save you $10 million if I do it this way instead of your way. Because keep in mind, contractors, fabricators, et cetera, they have engineers on staff too. So if you ever hear the term value engineering, that's kind of the idea, is that an engineer produces an initial design and then it gets value engineered. Maybe there's a better alternative. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to sort of skip the rest of this. There's a lot of stuff here that talks about shop drawing review and terms and conditions and so on and so forth. I think we're probably getting a little too far into the weeds for the rest of this. We might pick up some of this stuff in our second concepts lecture. Maybe I'll recap some of this financial stuff. But the point is of this lecture, I want you to take to heart some of the advice I gave you. I want to see everybody here get a job and make a lot of money. So just keep this stuff in the back of your head. That's all I got. I will see you all maybe next week.